In this video, I'm going to try to get some work done on my engine. I got a huge disaster of a mess here on my bench, and I've been working on a few other projects. I'm quite busy with my actual job, and so I might have to piece together a few evenings' work to actually make a video. But what I plan on doing is installing the head, probably the starter, the reed valves. Yeah, who knows? Anyway. So in my last video, I asked whether or not I should put the engine together this way or take some material off, and a couple of people responded saying that I should test it this way first. And so that's what I'm going to do. Basically, I'm going to run it through its break-in period, and then I'm going to test it in its current configuration, which is quite a high squish. We measured it in the last video to be about 60 thousandths squish, and then it's going to get torn back apart. I'm going to remove the cylinders, take probably about 30-35 thou off of the cylinders, put it back together and test it again. Next, I'm going to install the reeds, but before I do that, because there's a little bit of chipping along the edges of these reed pedals, I'm going to replace them with some of these brand new Carbon Tech reeds. Fancy. When these fiber reeds are laminated, they cure with a slight curve to them. And that's not a problem as long as you know about it. All you need to do is hold it against your reed cage. And in my case, the way that I'm holding it down, I can see that it's bending out. I doubt the camera can pick up on this, but it's slightly out from the reed cage. So all I need to do is flip it around this way and put the screws in from this side, and it'll have a nice tight seal. You want to tighten these screws up, but don't overdo it. Keep in mind that these screws cannot possibly come out. You don't need Loctite on them, and you don't need to over tighten them. The screw sits up against the inside of the intake so close that they pretty much touch, and that screw could not possibly come out. Once again, I hold it up to the reed cage, and it has a slight curve to it in this direction. I'm not sure if the camera can see, but there is a slight gap here. You can hear that sound. That's the reed pedal hitting the reed cage. When I turn it around this way, it is now slightly preloaded against the reed cage, and it doesn't make that noise. I've got the reeds installed, all 4 of them, and I thought I would give a brief explanation on how reeds actually work. I know a lot of people understand this, but there are a couple of misconceptions about reeds. Basically, the piston goes up, and when it does, it draws air into the case. It comes in through the carburetor, in through the reeds, pushes all of the reed pedals open, and then when the piston reaches the top and starts to come back down, the reeds close and seal up, so the fuel and air cannot come back out into the carburetor. One of the common misconceptions, or one thing that people don't know about reeds, is they actually only work effectively at mid and low RPM. There are 2 main reasons for this. One is that at high RPM, the intake pulses are so close together that the reeds actually don't have time to snap shut. So you get one intake pulse, and then before this can actually close, you get your other intake pulse. At very high RPM, it might just stay completely open. A lot of that depends on engine design, how stiff the reed pedals are, how many reed pedals there are, how much airflow there is, and a whole bunch of other things. But basically, at a certain RPM, these basically stick open. The other reason that these don't work very effectively at high RPM is because air actually has mass to it, and anything that has mass to it has momentum when it is moving. So at high RPM, you get very fast moving air going in through the reeds. Even after the piston stops moving and starts coming back down, the momentum of the air will continue pushing itself into the case. When the air stops moving, the reeds close, and whatever pressure is inside of the case stays inside of the case. Engineers of modern engines, both 2 and 4-stroke, use momentum of the air to actually give a slight supercharging or turbocharging effect. They do this with both the intake and the exhaust, and it works quite effectively. There's a tidbit of information you didn't need to know. Anybody who's been watching the video series up to this point is probably thinking that I'm just going to put Permatex on these reed cages and also on the manifold and just bolt everything together without these gaskets. But you'd be mistaken. And the reason for that is that gaskets actually provide some insulation value. And your intake is one of the things that you want to keep insulated. You don't want the heat transferring from the case into the manifold, into the carburetor. I popped that reed cage in there while I was talking, so I didn't mention it, but this little hole goes at the bottom. I'm probably going to change the way that the cooling system works on this in the future. For now, just because I know the system that it has works, I'm going to leave it as is. All right. From what I recall, I want these coolant things pointing towards the back. That would make sense because that's where the cooling lines come from. Hey. Well, it's a new day, and after trying to edit some of the footage from the other day, I realized that my camera lost a bunch of footage. I didn't get footage from putting glue on the head. I also didn't get footage of actually installing the manifold, tightening it up. So thanks for that, GoPro. But anyway, it's a new day. I'm going to install the coils, flywheel, starter, and then we're going to actually turn it over. I'm going to be rewiring this at some time because it's got really old shitty wiring. And I think for now though, I'm just going to keep all this factory just so that I don't get completely lost in this project. I've got the new O-ring from the gasket kit for the starter. I'm going to put the starter on just to get some pieces out of the way and to get rid of some bolts. It's going to make it easier for me to figure out where everything else goes. Starter is installed. So I'm not sure why, but as far as I can tell, these Allen bolts were being used to hold the stator in place. When I took this engine apart, the timing had already been advanced. I marked it and now I'm putting it back in that same place. When I took this engine apart, I threw all the parts in a bin, and I was worried that I lost the flywheel key, so I ordered another one. I got this key from WSM, and then I was looking through my bin and I noticed here's a flywheel key that's obviously been used, and here's another flywheel key that's been used. So somewhere inside of the engine, probably in the case here somewhere stuck to the flywheel, somebody had lost one of the keys. I'm going to install this starter drive that I got with the flywheel. It's in much better shape than my old one. Unlike the people who assembled this previously, I'm going to install this washer where it's supposed to be. Put a little bit of grease on it, and install the new O-ring in the cover. Might have to put a bit of grease on this O-ring to get it to stay in place. I don't think it's going to give us an honest reading because there's so much lubrication in there, but let's do a compression check. Almost 200 psi according to this. Alright, now we're going to test the back cylinder. Again, about the same. Almost 200 psi. So that was an interesting test as far as curiosity goes, but it doesn't really tell us much. There's so much lubrication in there that, yeah, those numbers don't really mean anything. I'll have to actually start it up, run it for a while, and then do a recheck on compression. What that does tell me is that it obviously has fairly healthy compression, even though there's a large squish. So it's not going to have any trouble firing up and running. I was somewhat concerned about that, and now that puts my mind at ease. So anyway, that's going to do it for this video. In the next one, I guess I'll be installing the engine.